This is James Rem is going to discuss the Cranston Ritchie works. He's done a lot of background research and he knows a lot about Ritchie's mentor, Meatyard. So thank you for coming.
Thank you. Just more about the show. You may wonder why we would have a show of work by an almost unknown photographer 50 some odd years after his death, and it seems to me that there are three reasons, or three categories of reasons, that we might bear in mind. The first, and I think the most important, is that they're just beautiful photographs if you look around, and so they're worth seeing in any context, whoever is the creator. Of course, you can see from the title of the show that one of the reasons people know the name, if they know it at all, is from the title of photograph and some photographs by Gene Meatyard, with whom Cranston went out photographing as a member of the Lexington Camera Club, which he was president of. And Gene was both a mentor and, I think, a friend and fellow artist as things evolved. So that's a connection that is inevitable and will probably be the only way that Cranston is known over the years, however, because this work has not been shown that often, but it certainly stands on its own. It's interesting, I was just thinking about it from a statistical, empirical point of view today as I was talking to Elizabeth and Bill. Cranston left, I think there are about 838, something like that, negatives here in the archive, his total output. Some 183 mounted prints and some unmounted prints. Gene Meatyard's archive has about 18,000 negatives in it, and I don't know how many prints are regarded as top drawer prints. But out of the 183 or somehow that Bill and I went through, and I must say, working with Bill was a dream. We hardly had to speak. It was like we were communicating telepathically. Our agreement was sort of instant on what we thought was worth it. We pulled about 80 prints, and then we pared that down to the 44 on the wall here. Any of the 80 could really be up here. And when you think that out of 800 exposures, this level of photograph is worthy to be hung on the wall and seen, that's evidence of a very high talent that Cranston had going. Sadly, he only was able to work and live in photography for about 5 years before he died of cancer in 1961. You'll learn if you read the essay that he had quite an exciting, or at least eventful life before that. He was a paratrooper in World War II. His bomber was shot down. He was the last out of the bomber. He was wounded, apparently, on the way down. He was dropped behind enemy lines. He lived there for several days, hiding out in the day and traveling by night, living off apples in orchard until he got back to some British troops and to get back to the States. He had the Purple Heart. So he came back here and became involved in photography, and he was part of this small group that Gene Meatyard tutored. Dr. Noble McFarland was another, and I had the pleasure of interviewing him when I was doing the work on Meatyard. I discovered Cranston's work when I was working on the Meatyard books about 12 or 13 years ago. I came to the archive because there are a number of Meatyard prints here, including ones from the Red River Gorge series that was part of the book, The Unseen Wilderness with Wendell Berry. So then I sort of stumbled over Cranston, and I went through all the stuff, and I said to Bill, who was the photorangular, I said, "This is really good stuff. We should do a show sometime." And I was so convinced that this was going to happen somewhere down the line in my future that I made contact with Cranston's living brothers, Bernard and Carl, and met with them and interviewed them on tape and put the tape and all the information away. And then when I did a residency down here, part of my other life as editor of the National Teaching and Learning Forum, a publication on college teaching, I wrote to Bill and we talked to Elizabeth and said, we ought to do this show. So all the material came forward, and this is the result. So that connection between Cranston and Gene and the Lexington Camera Club is an important part of the photographic history behind these pictures. You've all heard of the Lexington Camera Club. It has quite a reputation, and I think that's a little bit relevant here to what's going on. So let me talk about that for just a moment. We think about Meatyard all the time because of the great prominence that his reputation has achieved. But the club benefited before Meatyard from the presence of Van Daren Koch, who had come back after World War II, serving in the Navy. He'd had a rather privileged upbringing. He went to a private school and he got involved in photography there. His interest and involvement in photography was a little different from Gene's. So he had a group that he tutored, and if you look at the notes from those meetings, he was telling them a great deal about history photography. Now, in the early 1950s, or late 1940s and early 1950s, there were not a lot of histories of photography available. Today we have many, but at that time there was basically one, which was the catalog from the History of Photography show that Beaumont Newmont put together at MoMA in, 1939. That was the standard. So this interest in the history of photography, in my view, did something to help make the Lexington Camera Club a more serious club from at least the 1940s on. Gene went on to tutor and have a small group, Farland and Cranston Ritchie, and his emphasis as a photographer was a little different. It was more philosophical and conceptual, and his own work is, as you probably know, is more theatrical. I make these distinctions because it seems to me, as I was saying to Elizabeth earlier, that Cranston, if you have to make these broad generalizations, if Gene is theatrical, Cranston is more poetic, a single lyrical statement. The Camera Club honored honored Cranston soon after his death by putting a lot of his pictures in their group show, their annual show. And then 10 years after his death in 1971, which was only a year before Gene Meadyard died of cancer, Cranston died of cancer in 1961. In 71, they put on a show here. I think it was here or somewhere around. And for that show, they printed out a very minimal notice of Cranston, which they passed to Gene. And Gene wrote a long note in pencil expanding on Cranston's originality. You'll see that if you read the notes that we have around some of the images, Gene singled out two things in the way that Cranston used the camera that were uniquely his own. One was a kind of panning motion. This is the kind of camera that Cranston used. It's a twin lens reflex camera. Those who know something about photography back in the film days, which I come out of, will recognize this as a twin lens reflex camera. Cranston started out with a Rolleiflex, which his stepson Brian brought back to him from Germany. But he moved to the Mamiya-Flex, which is what this is, because the Mamiya was the only twin lens reflex camera that you could have interchangeable lenses. So Cranston used this camera. Just as a, by the way, biographical note, after his death, his wife gave the camera to Gene. Gene didn't like interchangeable lenses and went back to using his Rolleiflex, but that's beside the point. At any rate, the two distinctive ways that Cranston used the camera, one was a pan, which he would have the camera on a tripod with a slow shutter speed, and during that slow shutter speed, he would move the camera either laterally or vertically. And you see, where is it?
Chris?
This picture right here, which is Gene's son, Christopher, who often went with him photographing, is an example of a lateral pan with the camera. The other distinctive way that he utilized the camera was with a kind of a zoom effect, which a good example is this photograph here. There are other examples, but this one you might want to look at later. This was done by the camera again on a tripod eyeball. And during the slow shutter speed, the camera lens would be racked forward like this. You see what I mean? Like this. So Gene singled those out, as well as saying that Cranston was a photographer who deserved to be noted and exhibited nationally, and he thought that would happen eventually, and to a certain extent it is happening. We are in the nation right here. in
Kentucky. Institutions there.
That's right. So that's the second reason, his place in photographic history, to take note of Cranston Ritchie. There are some themes and differences between Meadyard's work that seem to me to have emerged in looking at the two rather closely. I have two books on Meadyard, and I've spent a lot of time with all the prints here. They spend a lot of time in cemeteries, and if you look at Gene's pictures, particularly the early ones when he was really learning, they are very much about decay, which seems to me to be engaged with the notion of mortality. Cranston's pictures, on the other hand, seem to me to be about life processes. You'll see much more organic material, leaves, flowering plants, kinds of things that you don't see that often in Gene. The way in which the cemetery seemed to have affected Cranston is not about mortality so much as identity. So you'll see several pictures here that bring that theme to mind. For example, here's a photograph of a gravestone with a flag in front of it. The flag is fluttering in such a way so that you can't see the name on the tombstone. Over here we have 3 gravestones. 2 of them are hidden in shadow, and the third is broken in half so that you can't really tell anything but the first name. Here we have a place where someone has carved initials, and the bottom 2 initials are occluded by a leaf having fallen upon them. So this brings to mind the notion of identity being a larger concern for Cranston than mortality per se. One thing that I assert is that if you know anything about Mudge's biography, you know that he had a very peculiar sense of humor. He liked wordplay a great deal, puns and wordplay. And I think that's a sense of humor that he and Cranston shared. This is intuitive based on the material. And you'll see some didactic notes around here where I make these assertions. Here's perhaps the one that has the strongest internal evidence. You see a saw here in the closet and a hat together. And I looked at this picture and I was thinking of Gene's sensibility as I've come to know it, and I thought, you know, I bet to those guys this was a hat saw in Kentucky dialect. And the more I look at the picture and I see that they have set 3 daffodils in a glass here on the top shelf in this abandoned house. This is clearly placed there by them to be photographed. And I thought, that's a clue that we're supposed to see this as somewhat daffy. Then I began to look at this photograph of an old fireplace grate in an abandoned building. And I thought, I know these guys. I could just see one of them saying to the other, you know, that'd make a great picture. Anyway. There's another theme, and if you're a literary person like me, maybe you can go along with me here for a moment and maybe not. But Cranston's middle name was Noah. And if you look at this picture over here, you see what I said before about life processes and generative organic material. Often you see water in his pictures, right? And you see vegetation coming out of the water, being reborn in water, as you do here. Here you see the shadow of his prosthetic arm, the hook, and you see these leaves coming up through either floodwater or so forth. And when you think his middle name was Noah, you think, I wonder. At any rate, there are many beautiful pictures here. This is a photograph of smoke in the air. I mentioned that both he and Gene smoked, but only Cranston photographed the abstract patterns that smoke made in the air. I assert in the essay that there are things that Cranston did that Gene took a hands-off attitude for, and I take it as evidence of the deep respect and friendship that existed between the 2 men. Gene never manipulated the camera in those 2 ways that I talked about earlier, and though he made a lot of abstract pictures of light on water, he never photographed the smoke, but he certainly had a lot of it around that he could have if he'd wanted to. The third and final reason that we would hang a show like this about Cranston Ritchie, it seems to me, goes back to the epigram that I put on the essay, which I drew from Thomas Grave's elegy written in the Country Courtyard, where it says, where I quote the lines, "Full many a flower was born to bloom unseen and waste its perfume on the desert air." I see this show as evidence that we have all kinds of beauty and creativity around us all the time, in the past, in the present, and if we become attuned to it, we'll see it in the future. I see this as a monument against the fame game, in which we too often get seduced. So that's all I have to say about Cranston, but I'd be glad to talk to you about it and answer such questions as I can answer, and I really appreciate your coming to see the show. Tell your friends.
Yes.
Thank you.
I mean, he might have a, well, I didn't talk about the dog. I meant to talk about the dog. I went to such a big deal about getting this dog picture. You know, Gene made many pictures of his children when they would appear. Well, that's the subject movie. Well, Cranston didn't have any children. He had a stepson. But if you look at all of his negatives, there are a number of photographs of animals, dogs in particular. And I just love this picture of a bulldog standing on a swinging bridge with a blurred head. So that's Cranston's version of Gene's pictures of his children.